Welcome to Archive Vault, where we explore declassified records, hidden histories, and state-level investigations. Please note, some illustrative narration is AI-generated for storytelling purposes. All content is educational and documentary-based. From Havana to Caracas, state power in the Cartel of the Suns. When the Cold War ended, Cuba did not collapse. It adapted. The disappearance of the Soviet Union removed Havana's primary source of economic support, fuel, and international insulation. What followed was not ideological retreat, but strategic recalibration. Cuba remained a closed political system, but it now operated in a world defined by sanctions, scarcity, and survival. During the 1990s, the Cuban state refined a model it had already mastered: control over institutions, information, and security. Intelligence services remained centralized. Military and internal security answered upward. External partnerships became transactional rather than ideological. At the same time, Venezuela was moving in the opposite direction. The rise of Hugo Chavez at the end of the decade marked the beginning of a new alliance. Venezuela possessed what Cuba lacked: oil, cash flow, and international reach. Cuba possessed what Venezuela sought: a mature internal security apparatus, intelligence discipline, and decades of experience managing a closed state under pressure. What emerged was a structured exchange. Cuba sent advisors, intelligence officers, security trainers, administrative specialists. They embedded within Venezuelan institutions, not as symbolic allies, but as operational participants. Venezuela, in return, provided energy, funding, and access. This partnership was formal, public, and documented. Agreements were signed. Personnel movements were recorded. Entire sectors of Venezuelan governance, identification systems, intelligence coordination, internal security, began to reflect Cuban design principles. This was not covert influence. It was institutional integration. As the alliance deepened, Venezuela's geographic position gained new relevance. Like Cuba decades earlier, it occupied a strategic space between production zones and global markets. Its ports, airfields, coastlines, and borders connected South America to the Caribbean and beyond. During these same years, international law enforcement agencies were documenting changes in cocaine trafficking routes. Pressure shifted movement patterns. New corridors emerged. Some relied on weak states. Others appeared to rely on strong ones. Inside Venezuela, power consolidated. Civil institutions weakened. Military influence expanded. Control over territory, documentation, and enforcement became increasingly centralized. The state's presence was not reduced. It was reorganized. By the time Nicolás Maduro assumed the presidency, the architecture was already in place. What he inherited was not only a political office, but a system shaped by years of security integration and operational continuity. In public view, the alliance between Havana and Caracas was described in terms of solidarity and ideology. In institutional terms, it functioned as something else entirely: a transfer of methods. Methods for control, methods for endurance, methods for operating beyond external scrutiny. Years later, when prosecutors would describe Venezuela as a state-linked trafficking system, they did not describe its origins as sudden. They described evolution. The handoff had occurred long before the indictments, and it began quietly, through partnership, not collapse. By the 2000s, Venezuela's military structure had grown into a network closely tied to state operations. In documents later released by the U.S. Department of Justice, multiple high-ranking officers were identified in connection with cocaine trafficking. Investigators named the network the Cartel of the Suns, a term drawn from the insignia worn by senior military personnel. These indictments, issued beginning in 2020, outlined a system in which the Venezuelan state apparatus facilitated the movement of cocaine across international borders. Airfields, shipping ports, official vehicles, and government documentation were cited as components in an organized network. Evidence included testimony from former officials, seized communications, and surveillance of transit routes. The DOJ filings describe coordination not only with Colombian guerrilla groups, but also with international intermediaries. The charges spanned narco-terrorism, conspiracy to import cocaine into the United States, and related criminal activity. Rewards for information leading to arrests were raised to unprecedented levels, reflecting the scale of the alleged operation. Observers noted the continuity of structure. Venezuela's security institutions were highly centralized, with authority flowing from the top down. Decisions of operational significance were controlled, personnel were embedded in multiple layers of enforcement, and oversight was limited outside the chain of command. This mirrored aspects of Cuba's institutional design decades earlier. Investigators also highlighted logistical sophistication. Shipments were routed through the Caribbean, transiting maritime and air corridors with minimal detection. Intelligence suggested that coordination relied on both formal military channels and informal networks operating within the state framework. During the same period, analysts observed that Cuba's advisory role persisted, particularly in intelligence and operational planning. U.S. sanctions and public statements identified Cuban personnel embedded in Venezuelan institutions as part of a wider system supporting state control. By 2020, the combination of centralization, operational continuity, and international reach had created an environment in which trafficking could occur under the supervision of the state. When the Department of Justice issued indictments against Nicolás Maduro and other officials, it described not an isolated criminal act, but an ongoing structured system that had evolved over decades. The indictments made explicit what had been previously documented only in fragmentary form, a state apparatus functioning in alignment with criminal networks. Evidence did not rely on ideology or narrative. It relied on legal documentation, testimony, and seized materials. This established the operational reality that would culminate in the 2026 capture and indictment of the sitting president. The architecture, built over decades, was now subject to legal enforcement, connecting a line of institutional control from Havana's advisement to Caracas's operations. The Cartel of the Suns, as investigators framed it, represented not just trafficking, but the intersection of state power, security oversight, and international narcotics movement. And in this system, authority, geography, and control were inseparable. By 2020, the United States had formalized its concerns in legal terms. Federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York issued indictments against Nicolás Maduro, his inner circle, and multiple members of Venezuela's military leadership. The charges included narco-terrorism, conspiracy to import cocaine, and coordination with armed groups for trafficking purposes. The indictments relied on evidence collected over decades, testimony from former officials, intercepted communications, surveillance of drug shipments, and financial records documenting the movement of proceeds. Each element pointed to a network integrated with state institutions, where the same personnel responsible for governance also facilitated international narcotics operations. At the same time, sanctions imposed by the U.S. Treasury Department designated the Cartel of the Suns as a terrorist organization. Officials cited the use of state resources to move cocaine abroad, highlighting both the scale and the formalized nature of the network. Travel restrictions, asset freezes, and targeted actions aimed to constrain the system at the leadership level. As prosecutors built their case, analysts noted the continuity between Cuba's historical influence and the operational design in Venezuela. Cuban advisors, embedded for decades in intelligence and security roles, had transferred methods of centralization, personnel control, and covert operational planning. These methods enabled Venezuela's state apparatus to maintain internal stability while simultaneously managing international trafficking logistics. When Nicolás Maduro assumed the presidency in 2013, he inherited not only political authority, but an infrastructure shaped by years of centralized control. Prosecutors argued that this infrastructure facilitated the integration of criminal networks into the state itself. From ports to airstrips, personnel to documentation, the operational capacity of the state became a key element in the alleged trafficking system. The indictments explicitly connected Maduro to decision-making at the highest level. They described him as supervising operations, approving shipments, and ensuring loyalty among participants. These descriptions did not speculate on ideology, motivation, or intent beyond what evidence documented in official filings. By 2026, the system outlined in the indictments reached a turning point. U.S. forces executed a capture operation that resulted in Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, being brought to the United States to face the charges. This event represented the legal activation of decades-long investigations, translating years of documented activity into immediate accountability under U.S. law. The case illustrated a broader pattern. State structures, designed for governance and control, were leveraged in a coordinated manner to support international narcotics movement. Geography, authority, and hierarchy were integral to this system, and the actions of investigators, prosecutors, and intelligence agencies over decades had now converged on a single point of enforcement: the sitting president of Venezuela. The architecture of state-linked trafficking in Venezuela did not emerge in isolation. It reflected a pattern observable in other centralized closed systems, where authority is concentrated and oversight is limited. Analysts and investigators have noted parallels between Venezuela and other nations, including Cuba and North Korea, in the way state control intersects with illicit networks. In Cuba, decades earlier, the combination of centralized military command, intelligence oversight, and tightly controlled ports created an environment where the state could influence or monitor movement within its territory. While the 1989 Causa No. 1 trial prosecuted individuals accused of drug involvement, the institutional structure remained intact, demonstrating how a state apparatus could both enforce discipline and shield continuity. In Venezuela, this model evolved differently, but with similar operational logic. Military leadership retained hierarchical control. Ports, airstrips, and documentation systems were under the supervision of centralized authorities. Operational continuity was maintained even as personnel changed over time. When Maduro assumed the presidency, he inherited not just office but an integrated security and intelligence system, shaped by decades of Cuban influence. Globally, patterns of state-linked narcotics trafficking extend beyond the Western Hemisphere. In North Korea, multiple governments and international agencies have documented state involvement in synthetic narcotics production and distribution, including fentanyl. These operations rely on the same principles: centralized authority, controlled production or transit, and limited external oversight. Diplomatic channels, front companies, and military or intelligence cover are used to maintain operational continuity. The convergence of these systems demonstrates a structural phenomenon. In states with tightly controlled hierarchies and limited external accountability, organized trafficking can exist alongside formal governance. Logistics, enforcement, and oversight operate within the same channels, creating environments where illicit activity is embedded into state function. In Venezuela, Cuba, and North Korea, investigators have observed similar elements. Authority concentrated at the top, enforcement mechanisms tied to hierarchy, and operational networks shielded from external examination. While each case differs in scale, geography, and substance, the underlying framework exhibits continuity. By the early 2020s, Venezuela's network had grown in scope and visibility, culminating in formal indictments, sanctions, and eventually, the 2026 capture of Nicolás Maduro. The system's persistence illustrates how centralized states can maintain operational capability over decades, even in the face of international scrutiny. In every instance, the common factor is structure, power, geography, and control operating together to enable long-term continuity. After decades of investigation, indictment, and enforcement, the record is both clear and incomplete. The U.S. Department of Justice has formally indicted Nicolás Maduro and 14 high-ranking Venezuelan officials on charges including narcoterrorism, conspiracy to import cocaine, and coordination with armed groups. Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, were captured in January 2026 and brought to the United States to face these charges. Documentation exists showing the integration of state resources, ports, airfields, vehicles, and personnel, into the network described in the indictments. Cuba's advisory role in Venezuelan security and intelligence is confirmed in official reports and public records, demonstrating an influence on operational structure. The exact degree to which Cuban advisors directed or authorized state-linked trafficking in Venezuela remains unverified in open court. Connections between state ideology, closed governance, and narcotics trafficking are drawn from patterns, testimony, and intelligence assessments, but are not adjudicated facts. Comparisons to other centralized regimes, including North Korea's involvement in fentanyl, illustrate structural similarities, not legal determinations. The full chain of command and decision-making authority for historical trafficking operations in both Cuba and Venezuela remains unresolved. The extent to which systemic state control facilitated trafficking beyond documented indictments is unknown. How other closed or authoritarian states may replicate similar patterns of centralized operational control over illicit networks is also undetermined. Legal documents and arrests provide verified facts. Testimonies, patterns, and archival intelligence provide context, narrative, and interpretation. They illuminate structure, opportunity, and risk, but do not constitute formal proof of culpability for unindicted individuals or regimes. Across decades from Havana to Caracas, from cocaine to synthetic narcotics, the story is one of power, control, and the limits of external oversight. What is documented is not the full story. What is alleged is preserved in archives, testimony, and intelligence. The line between the two is where historians, investigators, and viewers must draw it themselves. Across nations and decades, the record ends where authority decides. What is proven, what is alleged, and what remains unknown all exist side by side. The archive, the indictment, and the silent corridors of power. Thank you for listening to Archive Vault Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive and found it insightful. Wishing you a great week ahead, and remember to subscribe so you don't miss our next episode. We'll be back soon with more stories from the archives. See you next time.